Okay, suicide prevention for first responders. First responders include a lot more categories than people normally think. Corrections officers, dispatch, emergency medical services, nurses, especially ER nurses, and then of course the traditional firefighters, police officers, and then this flag includes military because they go through a lot of similar things. But in this presentation, we'll be focusing on first responders. This quote is about police officers, but I think it correlates to first responders in general. Let's take a moment and read it. The psychological hazards of police work are less obvious and more ubiquitous than the physical ones. Police officers and many first responders see more misery and despair in their first few years of their jobs than the rest of us do in a lifetime. The list is long. Exposure to people in pain, to unthinkable cruelty, injustice, and exposure to the infinite ways, many grotesque, that humans die. All of this amplified by the concern for one's safety, frustration with the judicial system, the weight of responsibility, negative media coverage, organizational stress, betrayal, and wear and tear on the body and family life. I think this quote really hits home the unforeseen mission statement of first responders. They're out there dealing with the things that normal people don't even think of, we never see, and they see it on a regular basis. And this really does take a toll, which leads to, if you don't have good active coping mechanisms or work on your resiliency and keep yourself away from the red and more toward the green, the stress of this job can compile and can it really sneak up on you and hurt you in ways you never thought you'd hurt. And that's why we want to address suicide in the first responder population. So this is a word cloud. Suicide is a very ubiquitous term. A lot of people, it's right to the point, but there's a lot of stuff that kind of is behind suicide that props it up. Untreated post-traumatic stress disorder is a really big one. Depression, chronic depression is another one. Despair, hopelessness, disappointment, the cultural normity of kamikaze and stuff like that, euthanasia. All of these things kind of prop up suicide and in big and little ways can kind of lead someone there insidiously if they're not paying attention to their stress level. A great statistic, 85% of first responders have experienced symptoms related to mental health issues. It doesn't have to be being suicidal. Obviously, that is one end of the spectrum, but the other end of the spectrum is compassion fatigue, feeling burnout, exhausted. We'll get into that later, but 85% of first responders have experienced something on that spectrum. Things to know. The suicide uniquely affects members of the first responder community more than the general population. Suicidal individuals do not have autobiographical memories, and this is what reduces their ability to draw upon solutions. It kind of minimizes their problem-solving abilities when they're faced with crisis. And this uniquely leads to that hopelessness that is so common in suicide. This is really unique to the first responder. This is important to know about the first responder population because first responders, their career is about solving other people's problems, helping other people who are in crisis. And so you'd think someone that's so good every day showing up for other people to help them solve their crisis would have the tools in their toolbox to save themselves when their own time comes around. But it's this lack of autobiographical memory that takes away those tools out of their toolbox, and that is why you would think suicide wouldn't be an issue for this population, but it truly is. It's important to know suicidal behavior is motivated not by the wish to die, but rather by a wish to escape pain, to end the pain, escape the trap. And the trap springs from one's own mental images, thoughts, and memories. It's when your problem-solving abilities go away, your world narrows, you're hyper-fixated on that pain, and you just want the pain to end. It's not because you want to die, it's because you want the pain to end. And this tunnel vision and hyperfixation on the problem is what we call a mental warp. When you don't protect your resiliency, when you let yourself get into crisis mode for a prolonged period, like having untreated PTSD or having chronic depression that goes unmitigated, unmanaged, that's when this mental warp occurs. And then another unique factor for the first responder population is something that Kirschman and all are calling a moral inversion. This was the first time I had heard of it when doing this reading, but it really resonated with me thinking about my husband and how he's changed over the years. He's coming up on his 10th anniversary as a law enforcement officer. This moral inversion is real. Individuals who go into this field start out wanting to help, wanting to change their communities for the better. And all they do day after day is deal with the stuff that society lets fall through the cracks. And it can be really demoralizing. And over time, it changes your paradigm. It changes your outlook. And that's what they're talking about in this moral inversion. It is becoming jaded, seeing bad in the world everywhere that you look. Your worldview kind of gets distorted and turned upside down. And this is a paradigm shift, but it is such an important paradigm shift in the first responder community because they started out wanting to change things for the better, and now all they see is the worst. It's akin to an existential crisis. And when existential crises happen, that is a serious stressor and can catapult someone into suicidal ideation, and that's important to know. Police officers and firefighters specifically are more likely to die by suicide than what we call line of duty death. Line of duty death is whenever an officer or a firefighter perishes while they are doing their job. Often departments treat those individuals like heroes. Unfortunately, when police officers or firefighters die by suicide, there is sometimes stigma attached to that, and it is not considered a line of duty death. There are some changes happening now. I know in Washington, in King County, the fire departments there are now treating firefighter suicides as line of duty deaths, and those firefighters are buried with honors by their brothers and sisters. It's a really beautiful process. We'll see how it goes. A lot of people argue that by counting suicide as a line of duty death, it could potentially encourage more people to commit suicide. We don't know. They have had this policy in place for 2 years now, and so far we're waiting for the statistics to come in. They haven't been analyzed yet or peer reviewed, but that'll be something to keep our eyes on in the future, because that's a really interesting and exciting new change in policy that I think is supportive. But yeah, these populations are more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty if we take out the line of duty context. And we've got some data coming in after this to support that. And then another unique factor for first responders is that retirement is a risk factor for suicide. We've got some statistics here from a 1980 study. That's a while ago, but it still is interesting to see. 334 out of 100,000 police retirees committed suicide I'm not sure, I didn't look closely what kind of data that study pulled, but that finding was released in 1980. So it's important to build up support around our first responders who are about to retire, because we know that their jobs are so closely tied to their sense of identity, to who they are. And so when they retire and they lose that career, they lose a big part of themselves. and that is another existential crisis and major stressor. So it's important to be aware of. This is a great quote. I love this. I think I've used this in a ton of my papers this class. When considering that suicide claims more officer lives than the nature of their work, the lack of open discussion by police is astounding. I wholeheartedly agree. All right, here we've got some statistics here to back this up. This is from the Rudderman Family Foundation, the white paper. These are statistics from the year 2017, but we can see, there it is in plain purple and gray. We've got line of duty death is much smaller than suicides. And then it's important to note, especially in 2017, we believe that statistics for suicide are underreported. I think I've got it later in this presentation, but I believe it's by 40%, especially specifically for firefighters. They believe suicides are underreported by about 40%. This is just for firefighters. This is a great study done by a woman from Texas University, but she actually gathered much more data. We've got a range from 2009 all the way to 2019. The pink line is suicides reported, and the blue is line of duty deaths. It's really interesting. In 2009, 10, 11, and only those 3 years we've got line of duty deaths far outweighing suicides. But we seem to turn a corner in 2012, and then that corner kind of gets much steeper 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. Wow, 2019 is more than half. That is crazy. All right, now we'll focus on just police officers. We've got a little bit less statistics, but we can see data from 2008 all the way to 2011. Line of duty deaths in 2011 exceeded suicides. That's great. Same thing with 2010. 2009, suicides exceed line of duty deaths. And it's much closer in 2008, but suicides also exceed line of duty deaths there. Statistics on police officers. The LEO who completes suicide is often male, 38.7 years old, with 12.2 years in the field. This was a really unique fact for me. My husband is 10 years in the field, 33, and a white male. So I'm going to keep my eyes on him for the coming years and just make sure he's feeling mentally healthy and resilient, because he and many of his friends fall into this, I don't know, we'll call it a danger zone, but a danger statistic to be aware of. And that quote is from data that exists for 2015 that is not displayed here. So we addressed this a little bit before, but how do professional problem solvers, first responders, become so overwhelmed by their own problems that they are reduced to a state of suicidal hopelessness? Again, people that spend their career showing up for other people in crisis and helping them, how come when it comes to their own crisis, they sometimes don't have the bandwidth, and why does suicide feel like a viable option to them? Well, to understand that, we need to understand risk factors that are unique to this population. Alcoholism. There is something that used to be called choir practice, where police officers would debrief after a shift by going to the bar and consuming copious amounts of alcohol and venting to their friends. Now, this was not a resilient coping mechanism. This is veiled alcoholism, and it compounds problems and stressors rather than alleviating them. Disciplinary problems. This can be linked to stigma. This can be linked to fear of the chain of command. this can create stigma and fear and a feeling that you can't open up in this way or explore mental health help because the hammer will come down on you. You'll lose your gun, you'll lose your badge. That fear can stop people from coping with stressors in a healthy way and kind of push them down and try and ignore them. Unwanted retirement, we addressed that earlier. The career can feel so closely tied to a sense of self that when you retire, you lose yourself, an existential crisis. Depression. Chronic depression. Again, I would say link that to existential crisis. Link that to potentially the moral inversion that we talked about earlier. You could link that to shift work and having poor sleep hygiene. You could link that to how adrenaline inducing the job is. When you are getting adrenaline dumps all day long, when you're not at work, you are at an adrenaline deficit. Your dopamine baseline plummets. And that facilitates a sense of depression of, like, some officers tell me, oh, when I get home and I take off my Batman belt, I have to sit on the couch for a half an hour and be a zombie. And for me, that makes me think of this adrenaline deficit, this lower dopamine baseline, where you kind of are a little bit comatose in your brain and your hormones are balancing out again. And it takes a while. Poor coping skills. There is a culture of just not dealing with stuff. Go at work and then couch potato at home or ignore it. Poor coping skills is kind of a partner in crime to just general exhaustion. If you're so exhausted when you're done with work, you don't have the time or energy to sign up for that yoga class or make the right food that will fuel your body better. Or sometimes you just watch TV all night instead of getting a good night's sleep. These all relate to poor coping skills. Financial difficulties, that's real. There's the catch-22 with a lot of first responders where overtime is how they make their money. And to be mentally healthy, often that means to say no to the overtime and invest your time in yourself. But that can create some financial difficulties. A lot of people with, especially emergency medicine paychecks, they can live paycheck to paycheck. Paramedics in a lot of cities do not make a lot of money. EMTs do not make a lot of money. And that's a stressor. And then, of course, there's the job stress. Every call has the potential to be a traumatic event. There are little T's, there are big T's, and you can get a bunch of them in one day. You can get a bunch of them in 1 week. And if you're not resilient, those can really pile up. Scandal. Again, that's relating to fear of losing your commission, fear of losing your badge. Oh, if so-and-so finds out that I have PTSD, they're not going to trust me to be their backup anymore. That would be a scandal. Closely associated with shame and failure. We can kind of link all those together. Distorted but culturally consistent rugged individualism. That would be like that hero mentality. Like, I am a problem solver. I'm a helper. I don't need anyone else's help. I am the help. So if I'm feeling depressed, if I'm leaning heavily on alcohol, I am an island. I can't reach out for help. And that is definitely a risk factor. Age, gender, those ones are harder to pinpoint, but they can be factors. There's a lot more nuance there that we won't get into today. But the last bullet point is a great one. That is a huge risk factor. The ubiquitousness of the presence of firearms. This is mostly police officers, but a lot of first responders are very into gun culture. That could be emergency medicine, that could be firefighters. And when you're into gun culture, you're very comfortable with guns. And when you're very comfortable with guns, there's a desensitization of their power. They're not as scary. They're more familiar. And so they can be seen as a familiar friend that can end my pain. And that's a risk factor, potentially. A lot of that depends on the individual. But there is the potential for that whenever you're getting that tunnel vision and hyperfixation on pain and sadness. Your friend, your familiar friend that keeps you safe at work could be the friend that ends your pain. And that's a risk factor for sure. On the flip side of risk factors, though, there are protective factors, and they can be strong. That strength can vary. Things can change quickly, but there is that strength there, that fortification. Some protective factors unique for first responders would be the access to quality care. They're very familiar with the healthcare system. They're very familiar with the ins and outs and how all of that works. So if they put their mind to it, they can get the help they need. There is connectedness to community, to social support. A lot of first responders now, thank goodness, are leaning heavily and pulling into their standing up programs in their departments for peer support. And that has been shown study after study to be a really great way to become mentally resilient, to lean on your brothers and sisters who know where you're coming from or who have been there and done that journey ahead of you, so they can report back and give you the things that you need to hear to get yourself out of it. Connectedness to family. A lot of first responders are very family oriented. It's that something about that paramilitary culture. It is so much about family, and that's a beautiful thing. Another great protective factor for first responders is being able to identify a sense of meaning and purpose. Again, we're looking at a population of helpers, a population of heroes, local heroes. And because they're doing that hero work day in and day out, that could be their why that keeps them going. We talked about how tunnel vision and hyperfixation on pain and sadness can kind of unhinge someone's problem-solving skills. But on the flip side of that, if they can get a little bit of that tunnel vision alleviated, get those blinders off, they do have those problem-solving skills. They just need to be out of the red enough so they can tap into that and use it for themselves. The ability to self-soothe. Not every first responder has this at the beginning of their career. It comes with time. I don't want to call it being jaded, but it is a little bit of having that armor about you to protect yourself from some of the really horrible things that you see on a regular basis. So a lot of first responders do have a coping mechanism of being able to self-soothe after those calls that you get day after day after day, and that comes in handy combating thoughts of suicide. Ability to adapt and to change. First responders are notorious isn't the great word, fabulously equipped to adapt and change in some of the worst scenarios, right? When they're responding to someone else's crisis, it's messy, it's unpredictable, and they are able to be that Swiss Army knife that figures out what needs to happen to calm, to massage that chaos into order. So they're uniquely able to do that. Again, when they're out of the red and can tap into those resources that they have embedded in their character or their job. And then cultural, religious, or personal beliefs that discourage suicide. If you have a paradigm that's been hammered into your sense of identity that suicide is a sin, or suicide is maybe not a sin, but it is unforgivable, that can act as a protective factor to stop you from actually following through. It doesn't stop the ideation, but it can help stop the action. So those are some unique protective factors for the first responder community. Oh yeah, we want to watch for burnout and compassion fatigue in this sense of meaning and purpose that comes from their calling to do their work. If you are burned out, if you have compassion fatigue, or more severely, if you have burnout, it can extinguish the flame inside you that makes you called to your work. So having a sense of meaning and purpose based on your career is less of a protective factor if you are sensing someone in the yellow or the orange or the red. Yeah, it's important to know with protective factors, they are not a stone wall. They are variable. They are less dependable than that. Things can change in a moment's notice. And some of those protective factors are more powerful than others. And again, there's variability in all protective factors. So we want to do thorough screening and really check in with people that have shared with us that they are having suicidal ideation, behavior, or have made attempts. Great ways to screen would be to look at underlying factors like depression, PTSD, substance and alcohol use. And all of those things can be sussed out with these great tests provided by the VA. We've got just the first question of each of these. So we've got, do you have repeated disturbing memories, thoughts, or images of a stressful experience? Again, these are from the VA, but we can definitely use them for first responders as well. That would probably be for PTSD. Do you have little interest or pleasure in doing things? I'm going to say that's probably depression. Are you abusing any of these substances? That would be substance abuse. Look at that, a very nice thorough questionnaire, really straightforward. And then how often do you have a drink containing alcohol? We're starting to figure out, are you leaning too heavily on alcohol? Are you a highly functioning alcoholic that is having that spill over into your life and start crippling your mental health? So those are all little examples from those questionnaires. Those questionnaires are great. I would use those for sure. They're also really cool computers that everyone carries around in their pockets these days with useful apps on them that can really make a difference. I've heard so much about the PTSD coach. I have a friend that uses it, and he really likes it. And there's many more things just like that. So you could carry a resource like that in your pocket, which is wonderful. So we know about risk factors, we know about protective factors. How do we, knowing those things, how can we create an appropriate strategy to battle suicidal behavior ideation in our first responder population? This is a 6-point plan that I thought was really, really cool. It starts with encouraging peer support programs. Again, peer support programs have been found to really be helpful. We're talking about a population that doesn't trust easily. You know, a lot of police officers will say, my job is to be lied to all day long. If you're lied to all day long by an assumingly, by the public, how are you going to trust the public to help you if the public lies to you every time you talk to them? Yeah, so peer support, they're not talking to the public. They're talking to their brothers and sisters who also deal with that. And there's a lot of strength that comes from being able to trust, and they trust their brothers and sisters. So peer support programs are wonderful. We need to see more of them. They're starting to become more popular. 2, refute the stigma that accompanies attempts to get professional help and the myth that seeking help will cost officers their jobs. That myth is out there that you will lose your job if you seek professional help, if you actually, go to someone with a license. Oh, they're going to report me. They're going to report this to my chief. No, they need to know the ins and outs, that is not going to happen. And they need to know that professional mental health counselors can be trusted with their emotional burden and with their confidentiality. Also, there need to be more mental health counselors that specifically deal with this population because there is so much nuance, because they don't trust easily. If you go to a mental health counselor and you share, like your least terrifying dead baby story, meanwhile you've got like 12 of them, and you're sharing your like most boring one but still makes you not sleep at night, and your mental health counselor's jaw hits the floor and they start crying, well, you're not getting any therapy there. You're going to switch into first responder mode, and you're going to mitigate chaos, and you're going to be once again in your helper role and not in your I need help role. So it's important that they get the right mental health professional to actually have a therapeutic experience. 3, train officers to engage in healthy self-care rather than using maladaptive coping mechanisms that they've been using for ages. It's important for people to know 2 beers before you go to bed to take the edge off does not give you good sleep. Yeah, it helps you fall asleep, but it doesn't keep you in a REM cycle long enough for your brain to separate triggers from memories to give you healing sleep that will prevent PTSD from a potentially traumatic event that you went through that day. You need to get good, if people don't know that drinking 2 beers before you go to sleep is not doing you any favors, then that's a coping mechanism that's going to continue. So we need to educate and get the stigma gone so we can all talk about this. And talk about healthy coping mechanisms that the culture may not always be drawn to. Like journaling. A lot of hard first responders that do jujitsu every day and pump iron and really take their job seriously. You tell that person to journal and they're gonna laugh in your face. But if you can educate them on how creating a narrative for yourself that is private is a therapeutic experience that helps you give a traumatic event a beginning, middle, and end, and then get filed properly in your brain so it doesn't become reoccurring and start interrupting your day. Well, now you've educated that person on why journaling is a great idea, and now you're one step closer to getting them to do it, getting them to go through that therapeutic process, rather than laugh at you and never give you a second thought. So education is so important. 4, raise awareness about risk factors and what steps to take when a fellow officer is contemplating suicide. Yeah, those risk factors can be a little bit of a mystery. Let's dispel that mystery and let people know what are some of those words in that word cloud under that big headliner of suicide. Let's demystify that. 5, develop and distribute a recommended course of action for chiefs following a completed LEO suicide. Ooh, that's a big one for me. In the Park Service specifically, we've had several officer suicides in the last year. One of them handled very well. 2 of them handled very poorly. If a chief doesn't have a SOP in place to help the team heal and to lay to rest their brother or sister appropriately, wow, it can be a trauma sandwich. Now you've lost your friend and coworker, and you've had like 6 other traumatic experiences around their death put on by the department. Yeah, we want to not make that trauma sandwich. We want to create that spoonful of sugar to help the one trauma go down better. And that would be a chief who puts into place a coherent plan that helps everyone come together over the suicide rather than bicker and argue and branch off by themselves and be sad and stew and vent and be hurt alone and all of that. 6, encourage agencies to investigate and report suspected LEO suicides using a psychological autopsy format. These autopsies done after suicides are finding all kinds of fascinating things about hormone levels and parts of the brain that are lit up and not lit up. We're learning a lot about suicide from these autopsies. So the more that are done, the more we learn, the more we can help people. Also, Investigations also help create statistics. We want these suicides to be statistics, not underreported. We need to know the magnitude of this problem so that we can treat it like the real beast that it is and throw the appropriate amount of resources at it. This is a really cool poster made by a firefighter named Paul Combs, who survived his own dark time with suicidal thoughts, and now he makes these incredible posters for other firefighters to kind of reduce the stigma. But I love this. If only people were wearing signs around their neck like this. Instead, unfortunately, they're trying to be islands, trying to deal with it themselves, or trying to not deal with it themselves and pretend like it doesn't exist. And that's not how we get the help we need. And it's important to know it's not weakness. It's not a scandal. It's just a normal. Again, 85% of first responders are experiencing some spectrum of mental illness or mental unwellness. You're not an island. You're not alone. Your brothers and sisters are dealing with the same stuff you are. If you talk about it, you can help each other. Important to know about your coworkers who may be thinking about suicide. First responders uniquely have a fearlessness regarding death. They see it every day. Death, mental health, might be stigmatized. Death, however, is not stigmatized. It is very normal for them. And when you have a fearlessness regarding death, that's one more protective factor that is removed. If you're not afraid of death, you're more likely to be death's buddy. See death as a friend that can end your pain. And that's a risk factor for sure. And again, a lack of good active coping skills exacerbates issues around critical stress, which forces a crescendo that can lead to suicidal ideation. And this is kind of the crescendo we're talking about. I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, green, yellow, orange, and red. I love this. I think it's so approachable for first responder communities. In the Park Service, we already do something called a GAR assessment. Forgive me, but I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but essentially it is like you are going into a dangerous situation to help someone in an austere environment, and you turn to your comrades and are constantly evaluating and mitigating risk. You're saying, hey, are you green? You think we're safe and we've mitigated all of the risk to do this? Are you yellow, orange, or red? If anyone is red, we are going to stop all and not do it and have a conversation or do more planning or abort mission. But it's an easy way, green, yellow, orange, red, to have it's a color that says 1,000 words. We can make decisions in the field quickly based on this super fast GAR assessment. So why not use it for mental health? It's better to talk uncoded about your mental health, but since there's so much stigma around mental health, let's create a code. Let's just say, I'm in the red. That's going to speak volumes. It's going to tell someone we have excessive anxiety, panic attacks, we're not sleeping, we have chronic depression, we're struggling to concentrate, we cannot perform our duties, we're in constant fatigue, we're fleeing social environments, we're leaning heavily on alcohol or gambling or other addictions, having suicidal thoughts. You can just say, I'm in the red. It's going to speak all of that. If you can't, it's a great way to do it. And then we've got this spectrum. So every call is a potentially traumatic event for a first responder. And I think this model can help them understand, like, oh, I went to a dead baby call as a paramedic and I had to do CPR for X number of minutes, even though baby was clearly dead. And now, 2 weeks later, I can't sleep and I'm thinking of dead baby. It's important for that paramedic to know, because they could be like, oh my God, I have PTSD now and I can't do my job. This model helps them understand, hey, you have PTSD-like symptoms, no one's gonna diagnose you with PTSD unless this persists for 6 months or more. But you could be in the yellow or the orange. You could be injured from that call, and you can apply healthy, active coping mechanisms to get yourself back toward green. Isn't that a lovely and approachable way to talk to that person and comfort them and demystify what they're going through and be like, yo, it's okay. You perform CPR on a dead baby for 20 minutes. That sucks. You're injured. You can get back to green. It doesn't happen overnight. I just love this model. I think it's a great way to have conversations like that. And I think conversations like that are super important. So this is a great tool. Impulsiveness. This is kind of the buzzword that I've learned in this course. I think it's an approachable way for me to understand suicide of a friend of mine who we were all kicking ourselves. We're like, oh my God, why didn't I see the red flags? Why didn't I reach out? Why didn't I call? Why didn't I have them over for dinner? Why didn't I check on them? And knowing about the impulsiveness of some of these acts of suicide helped me personally heal. Because now I understand my friend probably thought about it for 5 minutes and then acted. And I didn't see them every day for 3 months. It was a 5-minute window, not a year-long or a month-long window where I wasn't the good friend that saw the issue and intervened. So this was helpful for me, this part of the lesson. So I love this study that I found during this course. It's from 2001, it's the University of Houston. They interviewed 153 survivors of suicide attempts by firearm. We can read between the lines there and know that these are mostly people that shot themselves in the head, but somehow miraculously survived. So we were able to talk to them and find out what the moments leading up to when they pulled the trigger were like. So we got statistics from interviewing those the University of Houston got statistics from those 153 survivors. They found out that 13% had contemplated shooting themselves for 8 hours or more. 8 hours is still a very small window for you to see that person day to day. And, you're not seeing that person for shifts on a row and picking up on little red flags or little crumbs that they're putting down so that you can intervene. 8 hours is a very small window. But that's 13%. 70% reported they decided to act and did in less than an hour. An hour. What a small window to be able to intervene. What an impulsive, sad, dark hour of their lives. And then this was the real crazy one for me. 24%. I think that's a very high, obviously not as high as 70, but 24% is a huge chunk of the pie. Reported that they decided to act and did in 5 minutes or less. Again, that was the healing information that I needed to know. And I think that's the healing information that my fellow friends need to know. A message that I'd like to share with others who were beating themselves up. I know I have one friend, he's like, I literally have a PTSD ribbon on my patrol vehicle. And the night before our friend killed himself, we were leaning against my patrol vehicle, shooting the shit. And I didn't see any red flags. I didn't know that my friend was hurting so bad. For that officer to know that our friend potentially acted on impulse in 5 minutes or less, I think that would be very healing information for him. So this was a really big breakthrough for me. And then we learned about how to help people who are, again, the ubiquitous presence of firearms, the firearm friendly culture. I love it. I'm part of it. I love firearms. But if you know that acting on suicidal ideation is often in the first responder community an impulsive act, then we can combat that impulsiveness by locking firearms away, keeping them in the house still, but inaccessible. If we have a 5-minute window, and it's going to take you more than 5 minutes to go to X room of the house, ask so-and-so for the new PIN number to get into the safe, and all of a sudden it's been 6 minutes or 7 minutes, that person could have snapped out of it and no longer in that impulsive window and can engage some more rational, critical thinking to their situation. That could save their life. So we know that securing firearms at home can cut out the power of this impulsivity, and that's a big deal. Red flags. What to look for if your coworker is presenting red flags. That negative self-talk. I'm a failure. I'm a loser. I am useless. What a miserable life story. Wouldn't it be better if I didn't exist? Those are huge red flags. This is a big one. Showing impulsiveness in extreme work environments. In the Park Service, there are a lot, like currently I'm at the Grand Canyon. If a coworker, like we all know what to do when we're doing stuff over the edge. We've got our zones, you don't go in unless you're, on a belay device and got your harness on and your helmet and the rest of your PPE. But like if you have a coworker who knows all of those rules and in the past has followed all those rules correctly as they're supposed to, but all of a sudden they're like hanging out on that edge without their harness on or without being tied in, like that is super impulsive behavior that they know better. That they know that they're going outside of SOPs. So that would be an example of impulsiveness in an extreme work environment, which I would also say is self-destructive or reckless behavior, which is another red flag. Another red flag, comments about burdensomeness. We know burdensomeness and hopelessness are the two buddies that are hanging out with when they team up, suicide is not far behind. We don't want those guys together. So people are talking about how burdensome they are, then we know that they're potentially contemplating suicide and we should address it. Abusing drugs or alcohol, especially if it is unlike them, increased isolation. Giving possessions away, that's a classic red flag for suicide. That's a classic red flag for any suicide, but we see it in first responders as well. And then dramatic changes in behavior. It doesn't have to be an extreme environment, just any dramatic change. We should check up on that person. That could be a red flag. That could be something like the loss of a child, a divorce, maybe being in an officer-involved shooting, or they had that dead baby call, and they're just not the same after. We want to check up on that person. But sometimes, again, there are no red flags, like my friend. No red flags, just happened. It felt like out of the blue. But, you can't read minds. You can't read minds, but just know that you can't read minds. And know that a person that's seriously contemplating suicide, like it is on the table for them, there's no cartoon version of them. Like they could be not confused, like not self-destructive. They could be operating rationally, like this is the best option, I'm gonna do this. So you're not looking for like a cartoon version of a person like, oh my gosh, I'm irrational right now, I'm gonna do it. No, you're not necessarily looking for an irrational person. You could see a very rational, highly functioning person before you and not know that they're contemplating suicide because nothing seems out of order to you. It doesn't mean that something's not out of order in their head, because again, you cannot read minds. And they could be thinking about it for a long time, and you can never know. So don't kick yourself. We need to normalize emotions that look like this. Because we all have them, and to think that people are walking around without this in their brains is just wrong, and you're putting people on a pedestal that doesn't exist. We're all like this. So let's normalize it. Some resources to help. Again, I'm at the Grand Canyon now, but I'll be moving to Las Vegas, so I was really interested in some Nevada resources, and turns out there's quite a few, which is great. And then you've got your classic National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. There's crisis text line. There's cop line specific. There's all kinds of great stuff. So we want to just demystify what's going on with our first responder population and why are they contemplating suicide. And then we want to demystify the treatments. Like, if someone's contemplating suicide, what happens next? Like, a lot of people don't know when you seek professional mental health help, what does that look like? So let's educate people on the different types of therapies that are out there, because then they can shop around instead of when they do really need help, then they're like just blown away and intimidated by all the different kinds of therapy that are out there. So if we educate people ahead of time, then when shit hits the fan, they know what to do. So treatments for suicidal ideation and behavior and attempts and all that stuff. We've got cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. There's medications. Ketamine microdosing is becoming really popular where I am. There's a clinic in Flagstaff that a couple of first responders that I know have talked about. I believe they would still need to be, I personally need to demystify that for myself, because I don't know if that falls under the realm of mental health help that would not make them lose their commission. I don't know. I need to find out more about that. I'm sure it's state to state, but very interesting one. Somatic experiencing, and then the very popular one with first responders that are in my circles that kind of got me curious about the masters that I'm seeking now is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR. A lot of first responders are aware of EMDR now, and they're seeking out counselors that can do this specifically. So it's good to know about. Yeah, so those are my resources. So thank you very much. That was a great class. Really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thank you.